Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your attendance here, and I think the fact that you are here in good numbers is a compliment both to the subject and to our speaker this evening. There's no doubt, I think, that there is a renewed spotlight on the maritime domain and maritime issues, not least because of the activities of the likes of Russia and China, but also because of other fairly significant geostrategic and, dare one say, also technological developments. And all of these pose significant challenges for not just naval and maritime practitioners, but also the political leaderships in various maritime nations as they try to fashion viable strategies for the 21st century. Now, these, I think, are the issues that our speaker this evening will address, and he's eminently qualified to do so. A lot of you here I know him well, but just by way of a short introduction from me, he had a very distinguished career in the Royal Navy, including notable service in the Falklands conflict, rising to senior rank in command at sea, including in task group formation, but more apposite in terms of our discussions this evening, held senior assignments in the Ministry of Defence overseeing capabilities, but even more so the development of concepts and doctrines in the MOD. Even before he left the Navy, he'd already got something of a reputation as a distinguished commentator, a thought-provoking and, dare one say, provocative on occasions commentator, and he certainly cemented that reputation and profile subsequently following his departure from the Navy, as you know, those who tuned into the Today programme only this morning will be able to testify. Amongst his publications are Superhighway, an excellent, yes, there you are, an excellent publication and a tour d'horizon of the strategic seascape out there, and I offer only as a recommendation that it's one of those books that one wish one had written oneself. And his other publications include a very insightful memoir of his time down south, and that is indeed the name of the book, which also includes some interesting lessons learned insights. So that, I think, more than says enough about his credentials for speaking this evening. He will speak, I think, for about 30 minutes, give or take, and then we'll have some question and answer afterwards. I'll talk a little bit more about the rules of engagement for that, but all of the session this evening is on the record. So without further ado, I will pass over to, as I think he's proud to call himself now, Rear Admiral Dr. Chris Parry.
Thanks very much indeed for coming to this event rather than the one at Rusi. You'll be delighted to know that what I have to say has not been written by a staff officer and has not been cleared by the Secretary of State for Defence. So you're in the free thinking side of things. But I believe that across the world today, to a large extent, not exclusively, we have a generation of politicians who do not understand the sea, nor do they understand how to threaten or use force at sea in support of political objectives. So there's a need to recalibrate what statesmen think about sea power. Well, let me redefine that. What politicians think about sea power, because politicians think of the next election, whereas statesmen think about the next generation, I would suggest. Okay, before we start, I better give you a health warning. This is what certain people have said about me. Okay, and because it's George Galloway and Jeremy Corbyn, it goes straight to the top of my CV every time. Okay, and what occasioned these statements was a lecture I gave at the Royal United Services Institute in 2007, where I was asked what the top 5 threats to Europe were going to be in the next 10 years. And those of you who worked with me at the DCDC at the time will know that they were those. didn't quite identify Islamic State as being the 20,000 jihadists. Now, I have to tell you that those forecasts got me an interview with the Secretary of State and these reactions. So I would say to all of you who want to be First Sea Lord, you are in the business of making smart decisions, not correct decisions. Okay, if you're in war, the reverse applies, of course. You make correct decisions rather than smart ones. Okay, I think we're all agreed in this room that we're in an unstable world at the moment. We're unstable at the strategic level, the operational level, and also the tactical level, everybody's everyday lives. I'm not going to go through all the things from climate change, pressure of demographics, drought, and all the other things. You don't need me to tell you that. All we are acknowledging is that we are in a very unstable world. Excuse me. We also have to acknowledge that the major power centre of the world is also in flux at the moment. And the reason I put this slide up is I did some work with the Americans on the Korean crisis. And all I will say to you now is that you have to differentiate between what is happening at the front of the organisation and what is happening behind. And I have found the American administration in strategic terms to be extremely adept, with a high level of delegation to the Secretary of State level by the President, and a very intriguing way of thinking about strategic issues as a route to a solution. This is not an administration that is content to kick the can down the road on anything. So outcomes have suddenly become the issue, not the process. And that will obviously bear in what I've got to say. The one thing that has changed is that in the past, if we had a major regional or international problem, the United States typically would get together a posse. You and I call it a coalition, which it would lead, and the rest of us would come along as the deputies to sort something out. What I detect in the United States now is the fact that regions are going to be invited in future to sort out their own problems, providing their own capabilities and solutions, and if necessary, the cavalry will be sent. Maybe. And that, to me, is the typical defining issue that we are going to have to face in the next decade or so, with a change of American view as to how things sort out. And that puts more pressure on local allies and partners to provide their own military capability, but also to find, as I said, their own solutions. Okay, so what sort of world are we looking at the moment? And this is vital to understanding what's going on at sea. We're in an interdependent but highly competitive, unstable world, and we've got clashing capitalisms. And my Chinese friends will forgive me for saying that we've got everything from what I call market Leninism in China, all the way through to the social capitalism of Europe, through to basically Adam Smith, red in tooth and claw capitalism in the United States and the United Kingdom. We've got a variably polar world. Everybody says, oh, it's a multipolar world. No, it isn't, actually. It's spinning round all the time. People will be allies today. They will be opponents tomorrow. They will compete at the commercial level, but actually cooperate at the strategic level. So we've got a really complex environment going on at the moment. And we're seeing assertive powers, let's face it, and some of them are represented here, with global influence. And the real problem for us is the bipolar and unipolar institutions that we had in place to keep the world stable, of course, are failing us at the moment. And we haven't adjusted in terms of institutions to a variably polar world. The good news, if you think it's that, is that US power will persist. Like Madonna, it's got a fantastic ability to reinvent itself, and just when it was running out of oil, all that unconventional oil and gas arrived to save their strategic bacons. But in terms of internationalism, we know that they have been bruised by their engagement in the world. They do not want to be looked for anymore, as I said, as the people that are going to sort out every problem. The Middle East and North Africa is going to remain unstable for the next 20 years at least. And if you have any doubt about that, look at the demographics. Half the population of Yemen, for example, is under 18. That's a phenomenal rate. Its median age is 17, at a time when in Japan it's 42, in Europe it's 38. Look across North Africa and the Middle East, the median age is 21. So we cannot have any peace while that demographic plays through. We're seeing states divided between national ideologies, and they're authoritarian and ethno-national in their approach, and international attitudes. And countries at the moment, for their own social and political well-being, are sitting on the cusp of that. The United Kingdom alone is sitting on the cusp of that at the moment. But we have these differentiated states. And what we're seeing is a tendency towards a unitary state, bringing them together, but also fragmenting and failing and flailing states that are not coping with the rigors of this competition and interdependent dynamism. Everything now depends on the legitimacy, interests, and power diplomacy of regimes that are in place. You have authoritarian regimes determined to stay in place. You have elected regimes that are actually determined to stay in place. So legitimacy is absolutely critical. But one of the things that we're seeing is at the strategic level, we're seeing a global insurgency against the status quo. And we'll talk about that later. Some countries don't like the current rules, whether they're economic or strategic. But even down at the personal level, we're seeing an insurgency against social economic conditions, the inequality of which is seen, of course, on TV and the internet all around the world today. And the result of that is the symptoms are terrorism, criminality, cyber, and migration. They are the symptoms of a global insurgency by people who frankly aren't happy where they were born and their economic prospects. And I always say to people that across the whole of the Middle East and North Africa, Islam is predominantly the vehicle for the expression of these grievances and frustrations, because there are no other institutions that can actually reflect those concerns and aspirations. Of course, there is a hardcore ideological element to it amongst the really crazies, but by and large, there are millions of people whose aspiration can only be expressed through Islam. Okay. There should have been something on the end of that. Yes, there is. Look, if I see anything clearing out of the mists, what we're seeing is a bloc system emerging, which essentially is one that consists primarily geopolitically of China and Russia, wedded, of course, economically and geoeconomically across the Eurasian continent, and, of course, the maritime states, the United States, Canada, parts of Europe, Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and I think India, wrapping around Eurasia and forming into a bloc. Now, it won't have escaped your attention that both China and Russia have certainly their own characteristics in terms of their geopolitical ambitions, and the maritime states, of course, are predominantly English-speaking and also democracies. So you can see an ideological and a geopolitical bloc emerging. And when you reinforce the Eurasian element with the the Belt and Road Initiative and Russia's economic interests in Central Asia, you'll see that what we're heading for is another ding-dong battle between those of you who know and support Alfred Thayer Mahan on the left, and of course, and Halford Mackinder, who has the great geopolitical theory of the Eurasian heartland. But it's a bit more complicated than that, because these are not neat divisions, because some of the heartland countries now, Russia and China, also have aspirations to Mahanian strategy at sea. So it'd be interesting. But at the moment, the debate between Mahan and Mackinder, I think, is about to play out in our own lifetime. These are the things we're going to be scrambling over, I think. The polar regions, I think nobody really watching the activity going on there now doubts that. Breakthrough technologies, you all know what they are. This is nanotechnology, quantum computing, nuclear fusion, things like that. Productive and arable land at a time when the population will be 11 billion by 2050. Arable and productive land is going to be at a premium. Cyber and the electromagnetic spectrum. Everybody says cyber, nobody says electromagnetic. Limited bandwidth, fantastic ability to disrupt and manipulate, and it's coming down track. Talk to me about it afterwards. But also the global commons are increasingly coming under threat, both space and the sea. And the sea is what really concerns us tonight. What's changing? We know about the Arctic, not just the resources available up there, but the fact that the ice is melting and that we've got these routes that go from the Pacific through to the Atlantic and beyond, saving time, up to 10 to 12 days if you go across the top of the world, instead of going through the Suez Canal. And you've got 4 NATO countries, of course, confronting Russia's pretensions to extending their territorial seas, not their economic zones, all the way up to the North Pole. And currently, those are the 5 Arctic nations, as you know, Norway, Denmark, Canada, United States, and Russia. And of course, at the moment, everything is being held in check, but this is going to be an arena of competition in the future, not just for the resources, as I said, but for the routes themselves. And let's just look at where methane hydrates, basically natural gas, is found at the moment. Not just on land, but look at all those coastal areas. It's basically democratizing energy in the world today. And the reason there isn't more pink on there in the deep oceans is because we haven't found it yet. But again, energy always going to be a competition. And here's something I think that people are neglecting at their peril. It's the threat of rising sea levels. With a warming planet, and I hope there's nobody here doubts there is climate change, whatever's causing it. Okay, look at the populations that will be affected into the 2040s by rising sea levels. That's not the depth of inundation. That is the number of people that will be affected and where they will be affected. And that's quite an astonishing number of people if you think about it. And what makes me quite sober about it is that particular map. There are more people living inside that circle than outside it. And think of the problems that are being caused by 800,000 Rohingyas at the moment displaced into Bangladesh inside that circle. Think about 600 million people may have to find somewhere else to live, not to mention the nuclear reactors that are on the coast that are going to get more cooling water than they can cope with if we're not careful. Oh, did I mention most of them are on the ring of fire? Think Fukushima and think, actually, we're going to have to do something about this. And my point is that we all live together on this planet. This was the point of Herbert Richmond. The sea is the physical equivalent of the World Wide Web. Everything that goes virtually goes really by sea, across it, under it, or above it. And we lose that ability to be interconnected at our peril. And of course, the real irony is the cables that carry the internet are submarine cables. And you've been hearing a lot about that lately. And God knows why it took CDS so long to actually highlight it. It's in my book, Superhighway, from 4 years ago. But there we go. Okay, so let's have a look at what's going on here then in the strategic space. Okay, this is Russia and China getting together geopolitically. Okay, very good. Okay, but let's just have a look. And I don't mean to offend anybody here. These are facts. Okay, they're both of them are state-based conglomerates. They have managed societies and economies. They've thoroughly economically infiltrated the West. The most foreign direct investment from China comes into the United Kingdom. And the 2 words I keep hearing in Mandarin and in Russian, I speak Russian, are mobilization in the face of an unstable world and modernization. Well, why wouldn't you want to modernize? Okay, but what we're seeing is an aversion to current rules if they conflict with rights or national characteristics. And what I'm hearing is we'll have new rules or we'll have no rules as a threat, okay? Both are looking for strategic space and spheres of influence, and a Eurasian trade bloc is being engineered by the Belt and Road Initiative and, of course, Russia itself. What I'm also seeing in the literature is this desire to de-Americanize the world and its institutions. And I say that without any moral suasion on it. I do object to President Putin calling Europe a promontory of Asia, I have to say. So that sort of thing doesn't help. Okay, and also the Russian expression, war in peace, which you will associate with hybrid warfare and all the other things that we've seen as part of the Gerasimov doctrine. But the fact of life is, this is a mobilized society, particularly in Russia. I can't speak for China. But what we're seeing particularly with Russia is the aggressive use of irregular players, cyber, all the rest of it being used around the edge of peace and war. But together, this represents a significant, I won't say ideological, but a doctrine of actually being mobilized in the modern world. And of course, the Russians and the Chinese are cooperating more and more at sea at the moment, particularly on the military side. But the most dangerous thing from the Western point of view, of course, is that the Russians have invented a hat you can land a helicopter on. Okay. And the poor old Chinese chap, trying to keep his dignity there, I really feel for him, I have to tell you. I could not wear a hat like that. Okay, just to express this came out of a speech by President Putin only last week. You can see what his view is on this. Always like having Royal Marines in the audience, because when their lips stop moving, I can move on to the next slide. So it's, you only ever say that when they're not here, though. That's the issue. But that's a quite clear statement of intent. Okay, so let's have a look at Russia, shall we? Okay. Mother Russia's big. It's 10 time zones wide, as Hitler and Napoleon forgot when they invaded one time zone and forgot about the other 9. Okay, so it makes the Russians really quite sensitive about their space, particularly because they can't live in most of it. As you can see, because of the permafrost and things like that. Okay, so the bulk of the population, as you can see, is towards the west, with a small piece out to the east. Well, I mentioned earlier that they're trying to set up this Eurasian Customs Union. Okay, it sits across the Belt and Road Initiative, but anything ending in Stan, basically, the Russians want back in economic terms. And spookily enough, they comprise countries that used to be part of the Soviet Union. And you can see why Ukraine might be an issue in their minds on this. But creating that strategic commercial space is at the top of Russia's priorities. And we're used to looking at Europe like this. And I always say the most important feature of Europe here is it is a peninsula. It is surrounded on 3 sides almost completely by the sea, something that used to escape strategists during the Cold War. Let's have a look at it from Moscow's perspective. Now this comes from Time magazine in 1954, and essentially what it's saying is, and it's accompanied by commentary by Khrushchev, and he says, this is Europe, this promontory of Asia, this tiny collection of states on our continent. The United States is nowhere to be seen, and there are 2 arms that reach round and strangle Russia. They are the Mediterranean and the Black Sea, and they are the Baltic. Let's just have a look at what Russia has in the Baltic. Those of you who are old enough to remember what control Russia had over the Baltic during the Cold War will know that it extended all the way up to the inner German border. They've now got Kaliningrad, an exclave that used to be Königsberg, and they have St. Petersburg. That's it. And it makes the Russians feel just a little bit sensitive that one of those arms that reaches round to strangle Russia is mostly out of their hands. Let's go down to the Black Sea. The same things happened. Until they took over Crimea and the eastern part of Ukraine, all they had was that strip of territory just there by the Sea of Azov, where it says, okay, where Sochi is. Okay, that's all they had. The only beachfront property the Russians had. And surprise, surprise, by taking over eastern Ukraine and Odessa, they are now able to dominate the Black Sea again and prevent, obviously, attacks on Russia. More interestingly, let's go down to the Eastern Mediterranean. We know why Russia is involved in Syria, because it has interests with President Assad, but there's something deeper going on. If you look at the production figures for the oil and gas that comes out of the Eastern Mediterranean, within 10 years, it can supplant the supply of oil and gas that comes from Russia to Europe. So where is Russia going to sell its oil and gas if it doesn't sell it to Europe, if it's coming out of the Eastern Mediterranean? So it has a major strategic interest in that part of the world, quite apart from its geopolitical temptations to get involved in the region. Let's go up to the Arctic. Mentioned it earlier. Look at, in broad terms, how militarized the Arctic has become under President Putin. There's the equivalent of 5 brigades and 1 frontal aviation regiment that is committed solely to the Arctic. And please just look at it in broad terms. I'm not expecting you to answer questions on who's actually based anywhere. But that's quite a significant investment in the Arctic, in Russia's backyard. And let's look at the capabilities. We've got quite significant capabilities here coming on stream. And this is something that Nick Carter would have been talking about. And the combat aircraft alone are at least the equivalent of the F-18 and also the Typhoon. Probably struggling against the F-22 and also against the F-35, but these are significant combat aircraft. And certainly during the Zapad 17 exercise, which you saw last year, you saw the full range of capabilities to deny NATO presence in the Baltic, and ended by a nuclear exchange as well, to create the conditions for Russia to be able to dictate terms. Range of missiles, as you can see, ground and air launched, which mean effectively that Russia can actually coerce the Baltic and Black Sea nations without actually having any troops on the ground. These can actually be fired from over Russian territory. They're able to dominate, in particular, those parts of the world. And this is the S-400 anti-air system. And this is a very capable system, up to 100,000 feet and out to 200 kilometers. And it's significant if you look at the red circles where they have them deployed. They are deployed as strategic political assets to dominate the airspace. And I will say to you that no navy can operate without air power in those regions, okay? And if you have the S-400 there, most things are going to be brought down. So S-400 is a strategic missile system that if you want to get involved at all in these regions, look, the Baltic, the Black Sea, Eastern Mediterranean, you are going to have to neutralize before you get involved. So it's a major deterrent system. Okay, let's have a look at China. Okay, we know that China has a system that has peculiarly Chinese characteristics. It's different to ours, of course it is. But let's have a look at the view from Beijing. Let's turn the world round 180 degrees. Instead of looking at the Greenwich Meridian, look down the international date line. Because when I talk to Chinese scholars and I talk to Chinese diplomats, that is, forgive me if I haven't spoken to you, that is how they see the world. And that puts Europe and the UK way out on the edge of Columbus's flat earth. And unless we do something to address that balance strategically and commercially, that is the world in the 2020s onwards. And that's how we will have to start viewing things. And there's some very interesting things here. The day that President Xi Jinping visited the first aircraft carrier, this is what the China Times said. And it's quite interesting. Now, I must confess that I'm slightly worried about maritime hegemonism, terrorism and piracy appearing in the same sentence, because I think maritime hegemonism refers to the United States Navy. So putting it in the same group as terrorism and piracy is a bit of a problem. But, you know, there's a statement of intent. And the last line is even more significant. So China is reverting very much to what it used to be before the Europeans got into the Indian Ocean. And the one person you should pay attention to is Zheng He, a Chinese admiral of the 15th century. And those are the routes that he actually used to patrol and used to safeguard. He safeguarded essentially a trading and tribute hub in the Asia-Pacific region, and the routes, as you can see, to Africa, the Persian Gulf, the Red Sea, and beyond. And I'd like you to keep that picture in your mind, because if you look at Deutsche Bank's assessment of Chinese overseas direct investment by destination, you'll see that 60% is in the Asia-Pacific region. So we're seeing the emergence of that trading stroke tribute hub again, the 15th century tribute hub. And let's have a look where Chinese and Indian diasporas are. The bulk of the Chinese diaspora is in that Asia-Pacific region. So you can see this is quite a powerhouse building up there. And if we add the Belt and Road Initiative, not just the land one, which will take 6 to 8% of Chinese trade in pipelines, roads and railways, look at the maritime routes that go through the Indian Ocean, you're seeing a complete revival of what used to happen in the 15th century before the Europeans got east of the Cape of Good Hope. This is Zheng He revived and refreshed for the 21st century. And what we also see is a very close relationship with Iran, which gives China a privileged place on that Belt and Road, particularly through a route that goes through Iran, Iraq, Syria and Lebanon. And those of you who understand your Middle East will know that those are predominantly Shia-dominated countries. So to balance what's going on in the southern part of the Gulf, on the northern route of the Gulf, you have Chinese interests leading through to the Mediterranean as part of the Belt and Road Initiative, but predominantly working through Shia countries. So there. And what adds real sort of, I think, credibility to that is something President Assad said last year, when you might have thought he had something else on his mind. So, for good or ill, the Chinese have a plan. The Chinese always have a plan. And in superhighway, I say you'd always want your strategy actually formulated by the Chinese, your ships actually paid for by the Arabs, and a heritage like the Brits. So, so there's a plan. Now, we need to talk about the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea very briefly. Nick, are we doing all right? Shall we? Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I think everybody knows that territorial seas exist out to 12 miles and out to 200 miles there's an exclusive economic zone where you're able to exploit the resources of the water column and also the seabed. Any vessel of any country can go in any of that water on innocent passage out to 12 miles and conducting any operations from 12 to 200 miles. Now, here's the problem. Now, China, of course, has said that we have this 9 or 10 dash line that extends out to that solid line that you see there, what is known as the first island chain. It is in conflict, of course, with the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, and is one of these things that is currently upsetting the status quo at state and international level. And, of course, it gets even more of a problem because the economic zones of several countries, of course, the rights of certain countries to an economic zone obtrude into that 9 or 10 dash line. Now, who are we to judge the rights and wrongs of this? But as you know, all of you, this is sufficiently destabilising in superpower grouping terms to be an issue. Very busy shipping lanes go through there. There's oil and gas and all sorts of things like that. And of course, there are disputes over both structures and reefs that are in the vicinity. And this is an unresolved dispute, I'm afraid, that actually threatens, I think, stability and could offer the potential for conflict in the future, because you have a lot of status quo interests coming up against aspiring interests. And as you know, we all know, the Chinese have done a great job of reclaiming land, which doesn't count under the UN Convention, of course, of building into islands, still less actually militarizing them, basing aircraft, missiles and other facilities there. So I'm afraid this is an outstanding issue, and I would have to say from my own point of view, it fundamentally interferes with the idea that the sea is the common heritage of mankind, and also, if you like, the physical equivalent of the World Wide Web, because it fundamentally interdicts international waters. Chinese naval power, I think we know, is on the rise. Its technology and everything else is obviously something that we can admire. Apparently, that is the Chinese equivalent of Top Gun, bottom left, that came out 2 years ago. It didn't come out to rave reviews in China. I can't comment. Second carrier now, obviously aspiring to superpower and expeditionary status. And significantly, the DG-24 missile, the so-called carrier killer, this ballistic missile that everybody thinks can be steered onto American carriers. And it's been given credibility recently by the production of this picture of the impact zone in the Gobi Desert, which everybody says is, of course, an example of where the Chinese are using this missile to impact. Somebody needs to tell them that carriers move rather fast, particularly under missiles, but still. Good old Americans, being the Americans, have practiced actually having a warhead go off quite close to them and doing shock trials there. But it's significant. We have to recognise that China now has aspirations to actually be on the world stage, particularly throughout the watery World Wide Web. These are Chinese vessels operating in the Baltic with the Russians, and of course visiting us here in London. And we have to accept that China is now a global maritime power, and we can expect to see more of them at sea. Perhaps this we need to resolve in the short term rather than the long term before people come to blows. It also needs to be recognised that quite a few other countries try and limit what's going on in their territorial seas and also in their economic zones. And these are generally in contravention of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. Malaysia, for example, recently has said, you know, we don't want any military exercises within 200 miles of our coasts. And by the way, we don't want any nuclear power vessels going through our archipelagos. Well, that's only aimed at one nation, frankly. That's aimed at the United States. So there's a bit of power play going on here, but also totally illegal. President Putin last year, as I discussed earlier, has issued a decree saying as the ice melts beyond 12 miles, anything that becomes uncovered by the ice will become Russian territorial seas. Not economic zone, territorial seas. So my worry is that if we don't actually impose the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea in its entirety, then the whole world is going to descend into a series of competing and controlled jurisdictions, and the only high seas that you will have are going to be those that you can see in white there. Everything else will be controlled sea space, totally against the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, and frankly fracturing the engine of globalization that has existed for the last 450 years. That has to lead to disputes. And in this country, as you know, if you don't walk a footpath for a year and a day, the landowner has the right to close it down. And if we don't continue to use the sea as a public highway, and currently it's being defended with freedom of navigation exercises by the United States, we are going to lose aspects of the sea to a controlled jurisdiction somewhere offshore. Future technologies. We have to accept that we are in a world now where things are changing, and the following technologies that I'm going to show you in very brief are going to change every aspect of life at sea and warfare at sea within the next 10 years. And one thing I will say to you is I think we are approaching a dreadnought moment with regard to the technologies that I'm going to show you, where if you're not on board with these technologies, you might as well not bother being at sea and fighting, because I think we're going to go through a transition. First of all, ballistic missile defense. If you're not going to be in this game, you're going to be vulnerable to all sorts of asymmetric action, as we've seen with North Korea, but a lot of others as well. And we're seeing the United States, Denmark, ourselves, and the Netherlands all interested in this. But we have to recognize that hypersonic missiles, up to 8 times the speed of sound, are with us today. That is the Russian variant. Okay, 5 other countries are working on hypersonic missiles. This will make life for surface ships very uncomfortable indeed. And let's mention unmanned and robotics. To my mind, the doctrine for this has not been written yet. But I will say to you that the first encounter at sea in conflict will be between unmanned vehicles, almost certainly. At what point do you think that gets serious? When the 5th Triton has been shot down, or when the first sailor has been killed? How does that work? Okay, so unmanned is going to transform the way we do things. The Americans have a combat UAV, which they've flown off a carrier. They've got one they fired out of the USS Providence. It did, as a submarine, it did reconnaissance for half an hour, found the targets they were looking for, and then landed ashore via a satellite link from the USS Providence submerged. This is how we're transforming this environment now. And look at this. These are swarming UAVs. This happened last week in Las Vegas. Okay, 130 of these coordinated. Chinese can do it, the United States can do it, and look at this. Shape-shifting swarms for both deception, camouflage, and everything else. We can do this now. So think about the application of artificial intelligence, big data, and all the other computing we've got. Ally that together, this is a new generation of technologies. Directed energy, already at sea with the United States Navy, there it is. It's been trialled, can destroy UAVs and light aircraft out to 5 kilometers. You get 300 shots for one chemical tank in that. British say they're going to do it. Okay, this is the Type 31's laser. We don't have a proof of concept yet. And here's another thing that works already. The electromagnetic railgun fires a chunk of lead at you at twice the speed of sound out to 100 miles and demolishes whatever's on the end. There's no explosive in that at all. Kinetic charge alone will hit you. These things are now past concept phase. And if you want to see the shape of the future, this is the USS Zumwalt. Okay, the new generation destroyer. It's the size of a German pocket battleship. Okay, and much of that technology will be proven in this hull. Amazingly, the first captain is called Captain James Kirk. I mean, unbelievable. Okay, but expect to see this sort of technology revolutionizing, dreadnoughtizing what's going on. And the Russians are onto it too. This is their latest generation destroyer. Again, 14,000 deadweight tons. With an S-500 anti-air missile system in it and numerous other things that they want to bring to the party. So likely scenarios for the future. Okay, we're going to see a succession of frozen conflicts and contested peace situations. And for the Navy, what we're going to see is holding ground. Something the Army's been really good at. Okay, we're going to be holding ground in future with a bit of water on top of it. That's what's happening in the South China Sea. That's what will happen in the Arctic. So presence operations, the ability to go toe-to-toe with your opponent, is going to be very important indeed. Who will blink first in unmanned or manned terms? Because actually holding bits of sea, whether it's for resource or sovereignty reasons, is going to be very important. So if you're in the United Kingdom, pitching up against a Russian offshore patrol vessel that has 8 surface-to-surface missiles and you have a 20mm gun, ain't going to cut it, I have to tell you. Okay, you're going to see enabled state and sub-state players in future. Okay, and you're going to have a series of encounter actions, rather like in Master and Commander. Individual units, both networked and individual, will be confronting each other, and the political will decide what happens. They're going to have to go in harm's way. So it's no good going out if you're a Type 23 frigate with just 3 missiles in the magazine and hoping for the best. And I think the key feature is going to be visibility and vulnerability. So wide area surveillance, unmanned underwater vehicles and seabed systems, ballistic, transonic and hypersonic missiles, and this ability to do stealth, deception and camouflage means that life is going to be very difficult indeed on the surface of the ocean if we're going into true combat. And my answer to that is a lot more is going to have to go under the water, and submarines are going to have to adapt with all these sorts of unmanned and other remote vehicles in order to deploy quite a lot of the capabilities that you see deployed from the surface at the moment. Semi-submersibles, I think, will come into vogue as well, with the most vulnerable parts below the surface. So all sorts of innovation there. And the Americans right now are doing upward falling payloads. Only the Americans call it upward falling payloads. Okay, it's seeding the ocean with capabilities in canisters that can pop out when they go to war with people. So even now in the South and East China Sea, you might see these canisters out there. Chinese, I'd be worried about it. Okay, and mines, torpedoes, and other surveillance systems actually will come out of these pods. This is what the Americans are working on. And we also have to worry about proliferation. USS Mason here was attacked by Charlie 801 missiles. So there's one on the left there, fired from the Houthi rebels. Okay, that's the USS Swift being used by the UAE. That also was hit. Okay, it was wrecked. USS Mason shot them down. But look at this chap here on the left. I'm going to point to it. Okay, these are Russian missiles in a container, on a container ship that can be launched from that container ship. That makes it more powerful than a Type 23 frigate in terms of surface-to-surface action. So they're proliferating wildly. And let's look at various criminal things. They've got unmanned, they've got jammers, they've got little submarines they've made. They can jam uplink and downlink of satellites. They can fool retinal scans, and they can actually get into data systems at will now, criminal and terrorist organizations. They can jam. And I have to tell you, this is the one piece I need to get across to you today, is the electromagnetic spectrum will be the new cyber. If you have not hardened your electronic systems, they will be vulnerable to criminal and state interference in the near future. And just look at the scale of it if you take it up to state level. I have a little jammer, it comes from China, and it blocks out any mobile phone when I'm on the way down to Cardiff to watch an international at the Millennium Stadium. And we've got to think about cost ratios. If you look at any typical Chinese or Russian surface-to-surface missile, it costs us 6 times the price of that missile to shoot it down. We cannot sustain that. So we have to move to technology in future that will do that, directed energy typically, but we can't sustain the current levels of defence. And if we are going to keep up with technology insertion and things like that, we have to go for modular hulls that will take common data and power facilities. And some of those are coming in already. You've got the littoral combat ship. My favourite, the Danish Ivar Hiltfeldt class, fantastic ship, one that I would want to adopt over here, and of course various other permutations. And if we don't use our carrier as a modular biscuit barrel that can do all sorts of missions apart from just being a strike carrier, then we will underutilise it and it won't be good value for money. Okay, finally, space. For all these reasons, satellite communication and ballistic missile warfare, space is going to be important. We mustn't forget that we're going to see a massive civilian invasion of space soon, and that will affect our strategic options. These tiny satellites, typically produced by Surrey Satellites, fantastic beer crate size, fantastic capability. Again, it's going to alter our perception of how we use space and the facilities. We can put temporary stuff up just for that particular moment and provide our own web-based systems. And let's not forget that this is the sort of satellite imagery you can get just from civilian sources nowadays. How do we incorporate that into our deception and also our surveillance systems? I took that straight off the internet for 15 pence. Look at the granularity on that. It's going to affect how we operate at sea. Now finally, I want to talk about nuclear. And my premise basically is we are about to return to the idea that nuclear weapons are usable at sea. Now, it's well known that certain countries, the United States, China, Russia, and others, actually have warfighting torpedoes, shells, and missiles, nuclear tipped. Now, why is it changing? Well, because of precision, automation, robotics, and AI, and hypersonic missiles, people are going to need to say, look, if you use those against me, I'm going to need some way of balancing it up. There are other mass effect options, like what about the use of for example, electronic denial of service by putting an electromagnetic pulse over a group of ships or indeed over a city? How are you going to retaliate to that? How are you going to respond to chemical, biological and radiological? And what if you cross one of my red lines? If you attack one of my supercarriers, do I consider that a nuclear threshold? Just think of the Americans lost an American supercarrier. Not going to be happy. Okay? Is nuclear use feasible or realistic? Currently, within the theology, it's not, because it implies immediate escalation all the way up the scale to strategic. Are they scalable? Well, Trident isn't, because if you put a 3 kiloton warhead on one of my group of ships, am I going to retaliate with Trident against one of your cities? Is that credible today? And would nuclear release necessarily result in total war? We've had widespread cheating on treaties and non-proliferation, and we're seeing increasingly doctrine saying that nuclear has to be part of warfighting options and intentions. And indeed, remember what I said to you about Zapad 17. It actually was part of the exercise scenario from Russia. And what I'm going to say to you is we're going to see the return, I think, of nukes as warfighting weapons. If you look at the recent crisis with Korea, one of the outstanding threats from Kim Jong-un, and I believe it will happen, is that he is going to explode a nuclear warhead over the sea. Why? He can't practice in North Korea with it. If he wants an atmospheric explosion, he has to do it over the sea. Now, you might think that that's perfectly harmless. A lot of fish get fried, and there's a bit of fallout that can be contained. But there's a short step, isn't there, between doing that and putting it on top of an American carrier battle group. So we need to watch out for this, because I think nukes as warfighting weapons could be back for use at sea or in space. And as I said to you, it's already been expressed during the Zapad exercise, and it was centered on Kaliningrad, with those missiles there being launched for exercise. So, do we need a new nuclear theology for sea? Do we need new concepts of deterrence, because it's getting very complicated? And do we need new rules for other technologies like the EMP, like anything that's coming downstream that I've told you about. And how do we gain nuclear use and its consequences? What do we do if one of our carrier groups gets evaporated at sea? And of course, anti-ballistic capabilities have to come into that because vulnerability is part of deterrence. And it may be that we are going to return to graduated response with a range of nuclear weapons that are scaled according to the crisis that we find. My final word to you is this is a great world for pirates. Those of us who are professional pirates, because if you're not a pirate, you're not really a naval officer, and also entrepreneurial pirates who can actually find their way through this maze. I'm going to give you some concluding thoughts about the Royal Navy, because I have doubts at the moment. Do we really have a fighting service at the moment, or do we have essentially a constabulary that is designed to frighten people in peacetime? Are they the heirs of Nelson? Who are they benchmarked against? I'm not sure I know who the Royal Navy is supposed to fight at the moment. Well, I know it's Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, and the Islamic State, but actually that's not really good, is it? Benchmarking the Navy against that sort of capability. Can they go and remain in harm's way? And do we think that future procurement reflects the scenarios that we've just discussed? And, of course, okay, you've got to expect the unexpected. Thank you for your patience, ladies and gentlemen. I've gone on a bit longer than I was taped, but if you have some questions or comments, I'll be delighted to deal with them.
You said the one thing you wanted us to take away was to think about electromagnetic as the next cyber. I wonder if you could expand on that a little.
Let's just grab this one.
I'll write this down.
Ryan McKelney, former member of Glasgow University Royal Naval Unit. I wonder if you could expand upon the Maskarov doctrine, how it applies to potential to use at sea, and also how you didn't really mention anything about amphibious forces and how their use might evolve in the current atmosphere. Thank you.
Yeah. Electromagnetic, it's very simple. We've got limited bandwidth. We haven't sorted out a way of actually sharing too much of the bandwidth, so we're getting quite a lot of overlap now and interference within that. But more importantly, if I have a device, which I have at home, it's a small jamming device, it's no bigger than that book. If I go to a bank in the City of London now, put it on the windowsill and ring up and say, give me $50,000 or you won't do any work today. And it's already been attempted, and the bank said, no way, we're giving you $50,000. This device was switched on and no mobile or Wi-Fi signal within the bank worked that day. They lost $4.5 million in trades. Scale that up from criminal to state-based level. I believe that most of the systems in operation at sea today are vulnerable to a level of disruption that we have not seen since the Cold War. And if you look at the jammers and manipulators that are available on the digital scale rather than the previous scale, then you'll see that the capability for jamming and the capability of disabling most of our electronic functions is very high indeed. On both sides. I have to tell you, the Americans can do it as well. But we're not exercising or fighting on that basis, I'm afraid. And we need to do much more. The power outputs of quite a lot of our radars are far too low to be able to penetrate that. And if you add the deception and other things that are going to be available to shape-shifting decoys and things like that, we're going to be seriously challenged, to tell you the truth. And it leads into your Maskarov argument. And on Zapad 17, we saw heavy suppression of the enemy force by exactly what we used to see in the Cold War. Interestingly, satellites doing it as well. So they've got a high level of coordination. Again, I can't stress enough what artificial intelligence and big data and all these other connections are going to do for us in future, in able to spread those effects throughout the battle space. Amphibious, I didn't mention. I wasn't going to get into the operational and tactical. Those of you who worked with me before know that I'm not a great fan of beaches because everybody knows that amphibious goes across the beach. I'm a great believer in going to an objective directly. I'm also recently a convert to saying amphibious is about how few boots you can put on the ground, not how many. If you think during World War II, If you wanted to destroy a major target, you probably have to drop nearly 250,000 pounds of bombs on it. Now we can destroy a target with just one precision munition. Now what we've got to do sensibly now with people is to say how few people does it need actually to go and deal with a target or an objective. So what you can do now is screen with technology, systems and everything else, while your few people go in and do things. Let me give you an example. Missile silo. Let's say it's a non-specific Shiite nation in the Middle East. Okay, you want to destroy a missile silo. Now, the amphibious solution to that is land the brigade, build up capability, go and attack it, while the aviation and everything screens off any opposition. It takes just a special forces team to deal with the ventilation and the power systems. What you'd have to do is hold off the enemy for as long as possible so the special forces team can get in and get out again. You can stay at sea in future. You take your troops to the objective, you get it done, you get out again. You can use the ships now as part of the fighting platforms. You can use them as reverse slopes. You can launch from 50 miles. You don't go near the beach. It's as simple as that. We just have to think more expansively about what I call the sea-land seam. It's more sophisticated. And if you really get it right, it isn't amphibious warfare, it's trifibious, because you incorporate all three aspects of warfare into actually getting the effect that you need on the ground. But the stress must be in future. Just think about it. You go on the beach, you put all your logistics on the beach, and suddenly a ballistic missile arrives. Where'd that come from? So with loitering munitions, with unmanned, with all these other technologies, we can shape the environment to what we want to achieve and say, right, we can do that without people, if necessary.
Thanks. Lee, you had a question.
Admiral Chris, thank you. Lee Willett, ex-Rusi, ex-Janes. Picking up on the cable issue you raised, many people would agree with you that the cable issue, the undersea cable issue and the email comms has been around for a long time. And of course it was noted by CDS, as we all noted, he noted it, plus comments made in a couple of Royal Navy press releases recently as well. I wonder if you could comment on what you think is the reasoning for this, behind this sudden mention of something that we all knew anyway, and why the higher profile mention of it, please.
And I think probably just one more question, Tim Hume over here. We'll make this the last round. I see one other question. We'll go there and then Bob.
Thank you. Admiral, Tim Hume, currently working at your old haunt of DC.
Well done.
And I'm delighted to say that this year we're writing your future electromagnetic activities concept, so we're with you there. With respect to Russia, Vladimir Putin, one might say, may have transformed his military, but he hasn't transformed his economy. Would you comment, please, on his ability to sustain the level of progress he's making, and also comment on whether or not his focus is his external audience or his internal audience?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Yeah, absolutely.
And one final question, I think, from Admiral Bob Tarrant.
Chris, thanks for a really interesting discussion. Contextually, if you took you back to the beginning where you started with Herbert Richmond, is your thesis that the sea is actually going to be an unapproachable domain from a warfare point of view? Because actually almost everything you put up looked fairly bleak in terms of an operational commander's opinions of the future. Is that the thesis? And if it is, then is the answer in a different domain, or is the answer doing things first?
Thank you. Lee, thanks for the question there. Do you know what? When I hear things like cables and soldiers ringing the Samaritans if they can, and all that sort of thing, I think that governments are trying to distract attention away from something else. And I'm afraid with the UK government at the moment, they are drawing attention to things actually that are peripheral, because at the moment we have a problem with some of our capability. There's no question about that. Nick Carter's raised it, I've raised it, as you can see. We have to, I think, understand what it is fighting services are for. I mean, it sounds frankly, Irish to say they're for fighting, but we seem to have lost somehow sight of that, to tell you the truth. And cables, I'm afraid, come into that category. Partly we're outing ourselves because, as you know, WikiLeaks very kindly alluded to the fact that we could actually read undersea cables. That was blown open by Edward Snowden, who absolutely confirmed that we can actually intercept and read undersea cable information. And in fact, somebody said to me recently that was like telling Hitler that we had the Enigma code. So if ever Edward Snowden makes it back to London, I will be there with a pair of scissors to deal with any future generations of Snowdens. But the fact of life is that they are vulnerable. Everybody will find them vulnerable in future. If you remember, in the First World War, those of you historians will know that we cut every German cable except one, on the basis that we wanted intelligence from the one that was remaining. And indeed, that was the one that passed, I think, Jeff, the Zimmerman telegram went by that one cable, which we intercepted and gave to the Americans as proof as the Germans were up to no good. So, like any other channel information, these are obviously enablers, but they're also manipulators as well. I think in future, cables will be seen as peacetime conduits of information, and that we're going to have to supplement them with other means. Satellite probably, both temporary and permanent satellite, because in wartime, of course, they're going to be virtually unusable. I don't think it's an open secret that several countries, especially those represented here, have capabilities for actually dealing with those cables, intercepting them, eavesdropping, manipulating on them. Russia in particular has specialist vehicles. So, great peacetime activity, but cables in wartime, I think in future are going to be not something you can use. Even if you're neutrals, by the way, you might find them disrupted. There we go. Okay, so the economy and Russian momentum. It never ceases to amaze me as a historian and as a forecaster, the ability of Russia to get by on absolutely nothing. It's quite extraordinary. I'm not privy to the arrangements between China and Russia as the payments of that $550 billion exchange for oil and gas that was signed by Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin up to 2048. I know it's a good deal for the Chinese. I don't know how much he is actually cashing in on that, to tell you the truth. Russia still gets quite a proportion from its oil and gas revenues, of course. There's a significant amount of income goes into Russia from cybercrime. I mustn't forget that. And it does have some significant foreign reserves of its own. So it can plod along at the moment. I have to say that the latest submarine and surface ships programs, including the one I showed you, have been curtailed at the moment. But what they've got on the ground at the moment is self-sustaining, at least for the next 10 years. They have decisive missile and other offensive capabilities. And at the moment, again, I don't think it's a secret to say, there are a couple of systems that we would have difficulty encountering. The Akula 2.5, Bob, I defer to you. The Akula 2.5 is not a bad submarine, and would give most American, British, Chinese submarines a run for their money. So they're keeping up, if you like, with the pace. They're graduating, I think, their future ability. But just have a look at what they achieved in Syria and Ukraine. Nick Carter, I hope, is saying today at RUSI that their artillery flattened 3 Ukrainian brigades. And that's pretty significant. And you look at some of the unmanned technologies, you look at some of the other things they've got in the Orbat at the moment, that'll continue. And they're going to sell them abroad as well. So they're going to get income from that. And finally, I can't read, bleak. Did that answer your question?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, bleak environment. Yes, it is. I think it's going to be a very contentious environment. I think there's going to be a lot of eyeballing going on. There's going to be an arms race in technological terms. As I said, if we transition into the era that I've foretold, all the old pop guns are going to be like cannon on 18th century wooden-walled ships. Because if you get rail guns, directed energy, that level of deception and camouflage to sea with hypersonic missiles, it's game over for the current generation of naval technology. And the reason I asked the question at the end, are we happy with procurement, is because I believe the Type 26 and the Type 31 are legacy replacements, I'm afraid, that will not fit this environment in future. That is my firm belief. We have to be more entrepreneurial. And I know that China and Russia will adopt those technologies very quickly indeed. They will put the resources in place. So will the Americans. So, if we want to be a Coast Guard, if we want to be a constabulary, then we continue down the old route. And I think we're approaching what I would call a Themistocles moment in our societies. All of us are. Because they're going to be shifting interests here, whether it's confrontational or cooperative or anything like that. And if you remember the story of Themistocles, Themistocles said, look, we've got a real threat from Persia coming. And we've just discovered a whole load of gold in Attica and silver as well. And it's rather like the Americans discovering shale oil and gas. You know, we found all this silver in Attica. And Themistocles said, look, we've got to spend it on a fleet of triremes. And Cleisthenes, his opponent, said, no, we've got to spend it on welfare programs, pay it out to the citizens. So they put it to the vote. And I don't know if you remember in ancient Greece, you voted for the person you didn't like on a piece of pottery called an ostrach, and then you get the English word ostracism from it. And if you lost the vote, you got exiled. Well, the Athenian people voted for not 300 triremes, but 400 triremes, and Cleisthenes was exiled as a result of being voted out. And that is the fleet that won the Battle of Salamis 15 years later. And I'm afraid the nations of the world have a decision to make today. Unless they invest in navies and in their soft and their hard maritime power, the sea will go by default, this common heritage of mankind, okay, the physical equivalent of the World Wide Web, to those countries that can seize and hold land that happens to have a bit of water on top of it. And the engine of globalization will collapse, and sectoral interests and national interests will prevail, and that is certain to lead to the sort of conflict at sea that you possibly are envisaging as a result of what I've said. So unless we keep it open, unless we keep it free for mankind, it's going to be a contested space with controlled and endless rolling in counteractions between maritime forces, I would suggest.
Chris, thank you very much. As anticipated, you gave us, in a sense, so many rich themes in there that I think we're all still going to have to go away and digest a lot of what you said. There's almost a sense of, where do you start in terms of moving forward. But I think you also got a sense from the questions at the end that there was certainly a lot of thought provocation there, a little bit of provocativeness as well, as again. Advertised. So
leopard spots.
So thank you very much for that. Thank you for your attendance and for those of you who made interventions at the end. We're over time already, and I'm going to have to draw it to a close. But please,
my fault.
In recognition of what we heard this evening, in the normal fashion, do show your appreciation for this evening's speaker. Thank you very much.
Some hidden slides.